Hi, everybody. So I wanted to pick up with reading chapter 7. On Monday, we had read chapter 6. We talked about how Lyddie, at the end of chapter 6, was basically quitting her job, / she got fired because she had gone back to her house. And when she went back to her house, she met a black man who was a runaway slave, and his name was Ezekiel. And what she ended up doing with Ezekiel was giving him the money that the Stevens family had given her and Charlie for the sale of their baby calf. And so she gave that to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel promised that in the future he would pay her back and with interest. So Lyddie heads back to her job as being the maid at the one tavern, and when she returns, her boss is there, the mistress of the tavern, and she decides to fire her because Lyddie left without permission. And so Lyddie decides that she's not going to stay, and what she's going to do is get herself to Lowell, Massachusetts, where the factories were that were making, the mills and the factories were that were making different clothes. And so this week, I want to read you chapters 7 and 8. They're kind of short and sweet, and we just want to know what else happens with Lyddie and her adventures and what that 150-mile walk from Vermont to Lowell, Massachusetts is going to look like. So, chapter 7, South to Freedom. Lyddie set out at once, or nearly at once. First, Tryphena made the girl put on her own second pair of boots. They were, of course, too large for Lyddie, so she had to wait while the cook fetched 2 extra pairs of stockings and paper with which to stuff the toes. When Lyddie objected, Tryphena kept muttering, "A person can't walk to Massachusetts barefoot. Not in April, she can't." Next, Tryphena made her wait while she packed her a parcel of food large enough to feed a table of harvesters. And finally, she gave her a tiny cloth purse with 5 silver dollars in it. "It's too much," Lyddie protested. "I'm not having your dead body on my conscience," the cook said. "It will be enough for a coach fare and the stops along the way. The only tavern food I trust is my own." "But the mistress." "You leave the mistress to me." "I'll pay you back the money, with interest, when I can," Lyddie promised. Tryphena only shook her head and gave her a pat on the buttocks as though she were 5 years old. "Just don't forget me, eh? Give your old friend a thought now and again. That's all the interest I'll be wantin'." It was 3 in the afternoon before she could even start her journey, but she wouldn't let Tryphena persuade her to wait. She might let the mistress talk her into staying or lose her nerve if she didn't set out at once. Her heart was light, even if her feet felt clumsy in their makeshift boots and oversized stockings. She remembered Ezekiel and thought, "He walked north for freedom, and I'm walking south." She had forgotten in the excitement that she had already walked above 10 miles that day, but her feet remembered. Long before dark, they were chafing in the unaccustomed binding of stockings and the ill-fitting boots, reminding her that they had done too much. She sat down on a rock and took the boots off. But before long, she felt chilled, so she put them on again and started out, but more slowly than before. Then, just at dusk, the sky opened, and it began to rain. Not light spring showers, but cold, soaking torrents of rain streaming down her face, icicling rivulets down her chest and legs. She was obliged, reluctantly, to stop in the next village and seek shelter for the night. The mistress of the local inn was at first shocked to see a young girl traveling alone, and then solicitous. "You look near drowned," she cried, and asked where she thought she was headed. "Lowell, is it? Well, the stagecoach will be coming through the end of the week. Work for me till then, and I'll give you board." Lyddie hesitated, but her sodden clothes and blistered feet reminded her how unsuited she was to continue the journey. She gratefully accepted the mistress's offer and worked so hard that before the week was out, the woman was begging her to forget Lowell and stay on. But Lyddie was not to be persuaded. She boarded the coach on Thursday in the same dismal rain she'd arrived in. Handing over 3 of her precious dollars to the driver, she settled herself in the corner of the carriage. There were only 2 other passengers, a man and a woman who seemed to be married, though they hardly spoke to each other. The woman gave Lyddie's dress and shawl and strange boots a critical going over with her eyes, then settled again to her knitting, which the bumping of the coach made very difficult. With the muddy roads, it took 2 days to get to Windsor. They had not even left Vermont. Lyddie often wished she had saved several dollars and walked, rain or no rain. Surely she could have made it just as fast, but at least the disagreeable people left the coach at Windsor. The bed in the inn was infested with bugs, so she felt both filthy and itchy the next morning. Was not happily surprised that the coach, which had seemed overcrowded with 3, was now to carry 6 as far as Lowell. One of the passengers was a girl about her own age. Lyddie wanted to ask her if she, too, was going for a factory girl, but she had a young man with her who appeared to be her brother, so Lyddie was hesitant to speak. Then, too, she remembered the look of the previous female passenger had given her. The 6 of them were jammed into the carriage. There was hardly room for any of them to move, yet the rolling and pinching of the coach seemed worse rather than better for the load. Lyddie tried to sit delicately on one hip and then the other to spread the bruising out if possible. One of the gentlemen lit a large pipe, and the odor of it nearly made her retch. Fortunately, another gentleman reminded him sternly that there were ladies present, and the first man reluctantly tapped his pipe against his metal fixings of the door. But the stench had already been added to the air of foul breath and strong body odors. Lyddie longed for a healthy smell of farmyard. People were so much fouler than critters. And still, when the others weren't concentrating on keeping their seats in the swaying coach, they were looking at her clothes especially. At first she was mortified, but the longer they rode, the angrier she became. How rude they were, these so-called gentry. Everyone's clothes were a disgrace before they'd reached Lowell. The thaw and spring rains had turned parts of the roadway into muddy sloughs, and despite the coachman's skill, early on the last morning, they were stuck fast. The passengers were all obliged to alight, and the 4 men ordered by the coachman to push the wheels out of the rut. Lyddie watched the hapless gentleman heave and shove and sweat, all to no avail. The coachman yelled encouragement from above. The men grunted and cursed below as their fancy breeches and overcoats turned brown with the mud, and their lovely beaver hats went rolling off down the road. After at least a quarter of an hour of watching, she could stand their stupidity no longer. Lyddie took off her worn shawl, tied it around her waist, and tucked up her skirts under it. She found a flat stone and put it under the mired wheel. Then she waded in, her narrow shoulders shoving 2 of the gaping men aside as she set her own strong right shoulder against the rear wheel and ordered the men to the rear boot and called out, 1, 2, 3, heave! Above, she heard the laughter of the coachman. The men beside her were not smiling, but they did push together. The wheel rolled over the stone, and the coach was free to continue the journey. She was filthy, but she hardly cared. She could only think of how ignorant, how useless her fellow passengers had been. None of them thanked her, but she hardly noticed. She was eager to be going, but not to ride inside. She looked up at the still smiling coachman. "Can I come up?" she called. He nodded. Lyddie scrambled up beside him. None of the gentlemen offered her a hand, but she needed none, having spent her life climbing trees and ladders and roofs. The coachman was still chuckling as he gave the horses a crack of the whip. Cries of protest rose up from the passengers below. He jerked the reins, his eyes twinkling, as more cries came up from the irate inmates as they tried to disentangle their bodies in the carriage and settle themselves on the seats once more. He shook his head at Lyddie and held the pawing team a few moments until the jostling of the carriage finally ceased. "You're a hardy one, you are," he said, reaching into the box behind him to pull out a heavy robe. "Here, this will keep the chill off." She wrapped the robe around her head and body. "Silly fools," she said. "Not the common sense of a quill pig amongst the lot of them. Why didn't you tell them what to do, eh?" "What?" he said. "And lose the entertainment?" Lyddie couldn't help but laugh, remembering the sight of those sweating, swearing, filthy gentlemen, and now they were further poisoning the already stale air of the carriage with their odor and road mud. Indeed, someone was already raising the shade to let in a bit of cold, fresh air. "So you're for the factory life?" Lyddie nodded. "I need the money." He glanced sideways at her. "Those young women dress like Boston ladies," he said. "I don't care for the fancy dress. There's debts on my farm." "And it's your farm now, is it?" "My father's," she said. But he headed west 4 years ago, and we haven't heard. You're a stout one, he said. Ain't you brothers to help? One, she said, and he'd be a great help, only my mother put him out to a miller. So until... Have you someone to look out for you in Lowell? A relative or a friend? She shook her head. I'll do all right on my own. I've no doubt of that, he said, but a friend to put in a word can't hurt. Let me take you to my sister's. She runs a boarding house, number 5 it is, of the Concord Manufacturing Corporation. I'm obliged for your kindness, but think of it as payment for your help. You could have had it out in no time, had you? But never such fun. Coaching can be a wearisome, lonesome job, my girl. I take my pleasure where I can. Did you see those gentlemen's faces having to be rescued by a slip of a farm girl? They crossed the bridge into the city late that afternoon. And city it surely was. It seemed to Lyddie that there was as many buildings crowded before her as sheep in a shearing shed. But they were not soft and murmuring as sheep. They were huge and foreboding in the gray light of afternoon. She would not have believed that the world contained as much brick as there was in a single building here. They were giants, 5-6 stories high and as long as the length of a large pasture. Chimneys, belching smoke, reached to the low-hanging sky. And the noise of it! Her impulse was to cover her ears, but she held her hands tightly in her lap. She would not begin to be afraid now, she who had stared down a bear and conversed easily with a runaway slave. The other passengers in their muddy clothing and with their various trunks alighted at the Merrimack Hotel. Lyddie could tell at a glance it was too grand for her purse and person. In the end, she waited until the coachman had seen to the horses and carriage and taken care of, and then let him walk her to his sister's boarding house. I brought you a little chip of Vermont granite, he explained to the plump, smiling woman who met him at the door. Then he added, we'd best come in by the back, run into a little muddy stretch on the way down. So that is chapter 7.